thank you so much for being here. This is an amazing turnout for snails. I'm pumped. Jeff is pumped. Look at us. Yeah. All these snails are pumped. All of us up here are pumped right now. So welcome to the Natural History Institute Speaker Series. My name is Jessie Rack. I'm the program director here. So I help organize all of these talks. There's also a webinar series coming up. There's also, we do field experiences and workshops. So if you're not on our mailing list, you should get on it because we do cool stuff. So before I introduce the speaker, a few quick announcements. So just FYI, the restrooms and water fountains are on the other side of that wall. So you have to go this way and just keep turning right until you can turn right no longer, and then you're there. I also want to remind you quickly that we're a 501c nonprofit, and we exist because of your support. So we have little fish bowls in the lobby. If you feel the urge to support us and keep the lights on, we really appreciate it. Or we accept support in other ways too. We love volunteers. So if you have ideas of things that you could contribute, we'd love to hear about them. A couple of upcoming events you might be interested in. So next Tuesday, October 18th, is a one-day-only premiere event. In between gallery shows, we'll be exhibiting historical maps of the Southwest from the 1800s. It's very cool. It'll be open to the public only on that Tuesday from noon till 7. There's flyers in the lobby. They look like this, or you can ask me about it too. It's free. Just come on in and see our cool maps. Our next speaker series talk is going to be another Thursday, October 27th. And the speaker is Elise Gornish. So she's a restoration ecologist, which means she spends all her time thinking about how to fix damaged natural landscapes. So she'll be giving a talk called Cheap, Easy, and Old School Techniques to Reestablish Plant Communities. So she does things like make seed balls and do these very cool low-tech methods to fix that require kind of minimal funding and expertise. I'm going to Vanna White this too. So I have flyers for this as well. Something else cool about Dr. Gornish, she wrote the first ever kids book on ecological restoration. And so I have a copy of that if you want to check it out. It'll be like up on the side wall here afterward. One more quick plug. Sorry, I lost all my notes. Finally, our next gallery exhibit is going to officially open on Friday, October 28th, and it's going to feature a painter and veterinarian named Ken Gorsica, and it's called Portraits of Gaia. So if you hadn't had a chance to check out Adele Saron's work that's currently in the gallery, it's only going to be in there through tomorrow. So the gallery will be open after the talk tonight, so check it out. You can pick up an info card for Ken's work. It has this cool polar bear on it, so it's going to be neat. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jeff Sorensen. I have a whole bunch of things to say about Jeff because he's fantastic. So Jeff is the Invertebrate Wildlife Program Manager with Arizona Game and Fish, AKA the Snail Guy. So get ready. He's proud of that, so you can call him that. So Jeff completed his Bachelors of Science degree at Northern Arizona University and got a master's in conservation bio at ASU. He spent most of his 30-plus years with Game and Fish working on various fish and wildlife projects throughout the state. Over the past 7 years, Jeff has focused on mollusk conservation, snails, right, statewide. He works closely with volunteers and partner agencies and other organizations to develop and implement conservation agreements for native snails and to explore Arizona's native habitats in search of our tiny mollusk neighbors. His words, not mine. He has helped monitor and manage the Kanab amber snail in the Grand Canyon and dozens of other mollusks, including most of our spring snail species, which if you didn't get a chance to come up and meet them before the talk, we have some spring snail samples up here. They're like teeny, like tinier than a sesame seed. He has a number of scientific publications, including one last year on population genetics and conservation of recently discovered spring snails in Arizona. I wanted to read this, but I don't have access to the Journal of Molluscan Studies, which first of all is a travesty, and second of all, yeah, I'm sorry, I wanted to read it. Second of all, the recently discovered spring snails, should I assume that you discovered the spring snails? Or?
No, actually, I have to give them the credit where credit is due. A lot of our colleagues with agencies as well as organizations, and they're the ones that are finding these. They're the ones cluing me in.
Oh, that's cool. I'm less interested in reading the paper now. No, I'm just kidding. So I've been in the field with Jeff doing spring snail work. Just to prove it, I have the t-shirt, Snail Crew. It's true, there are several members of the Snail Crew here tonight, I believe, so look for us after. And he's just such an amazing advocate for these tiny creatures that you maybe never once in your life thought about caring about. So I pretty much want to bet that regardless of your feelings coming in tonight, you're going to leave loving snails. Like, he's just that guy. So with that, I give you Jeff Sorensen, who is a wonderful science communicator and just a delightful person, with his talk, Get to Know Your Slimy Neighbors, Desert Snails in Arizona.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in because I imagine a lot of you have questions for me. So I will just kind of rip through this presentation as much as I can, and then I'll take a lot of the questions afterwards. And don't worry, the folks here have been able to get me a room, so I got, all night if you got questions for me, or at least until they kick us out. So I like to start my presentation off with a history lesson. So snails are one of the oldest life forms that are on this planet. So 500 million years. They were there when the trilobites were, swimming in the primordial seas and all that. So they have a very long tenure on this planet. They were here before the dinosaurs, one of the most successful groups of animals on this planet for a very long time. They have survived through several mass extinction events, which makes them survivors. Now, I'm talking as a taxon group. We are going to lose species. That's just the way life is. But they are amazing that they have been on this planet so long as a group of animals. And so they've had to endure a lot of different climatic, environmental changes over their tenure. So for the most part, if you look at the fossil record, here's some examples of some of the fossils from way back when, their form and function are essentially the same. They're recyclers. They are, convert dead and dying plant material into plant food. So that's their role in life, as well as they are a big part of the food base. Lots of animals love to eat snails. I always say that if it wasn't for the humble snail, a lot of our wildlife would go hungry for want of a faster meal. So these guys are packed with protein, packed with the carbohydrates. The shells have a lot of calcium, which a lot of our bird species need for their growth and all that, and shell production. So they provide a really key part of our food base for a lot of our wildlife. And of course, even back in the Roman legion times, Roman legionnaires would supplement their meals with escargot. It wasn't escargot then, the French perfected that. But they actually had Roman snails. That's what they used in addition when they're off on their campaigns to help with feed. So why do we care? Now, this is a question I get asked a lot, and that's a very good question. Why should we care about snails, or invertebrates for that matter? Well, those of you that really are keyed on what's going on out there in the world, we've got pollinators, we've got recyclers, we're humans. We get to dictate what our values are and apply to wildlife management and natural resource management. So we have a bunch of federal as well as state laws and regulations out there. You guys are familiar with the Endangered Species Act. We have the National Environmental Policy Act, Sykes Act for on Department of Defense properties. A lot of our National Forest and Bureau of Land Management properties have their forest and land resource management plans. Our agency, as well as the NGOs and other agencies, they work together to try to manage those habitats appropriately for all of our wildlife species, including even the smallest ones, because they all play a role in what's going on out there. So at a state level, we have our State Wildlife Action Plan. Our plan is similar to the others across our nation in that we're identifying species of greatest conservation need. And we have a lot of them in the state. So Arizona Game Fish manages crustaceans and mollusks as wildlife. So under our Title 17 Commission Order 42, we manage crustaceans and mollusks in the state. So that's why I get to be a snail guy for the department. We also have scientific collecting licenses for researchers and such, grad students or professors, other agency folks that want to do work on this or look at what's the components of that, those habitats. So, did you have a question back there that I can answer real quick? Nope? Okay. I'll get to that later if you think about it. So as long as we value our natural resources and our wildlife, we have laws that are out there to help kind of provide those type of protections and management out there. And I would hope that 50 to 100 years from now, we still have that high value on what's out there on our landscapes. We all live here together. We ought to get along. So, Arizona is blessed with being a very diverse state for mollusk. That's amazing considering how dry this state is. But we have a whole bunch of different habitats, from the low deserts to the high deserts, canyon lands, forested ranges, the Mogollon Rim, the Sky Islands in southeastern Arizona. So we have one of the largest contiguous ponderosa forest in the nation. So it's amazing the types of habitats we have. And we have snails as our neighbors all over the state. These are just some of the ones that we're actively working on right now and managing with our partners. So we have about 200, probably more than that, native mollusk in the state, which is a really rich diversity for an inland state. You would think that, those that are on the coastal regions or those that have rainforest, tropical forests that are predominant, those would have higher numbers. But Arizona's pretty rich with its mollusk species. And those are just the natives that we have, not including the non-native introduced species. So this kind of long list are ones that we are actively doing monitoring and management for. So we have a lot of springsnail species, like Jesse told me. We're working on a lot of those. They tend to be very rare, endemic, which means they're only found at a few locations, as well as some of our land snail species that are grouped on some of those sky islands, like the Pinaleno Mountains, Mount Graham, as well as the Huachucas, the Huachuca Mountains. We have a bunch of places that we still haven't had a chance to really get out and look at yet. But at least these are ones that we're actively working on. We only have 2 that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Our smallest one is the three-forked spring snail. And I hope you get a chance later to come up and take a look at how small these guys are. The ones we have here are actually from Page Springs, but the three-forks ones are just as tiny. We also have a threatened one, single population left of the San Bernardino spring snail, down there east of Douglas, so right along the border. But the ones that we have the asterisks next to are ones that we currently have conservation agreements in place, working with our partners, land management agencies, as well as private landowners. So we're really busy trying to protect these species as much as we can to manage them so that we can keep them from getting rare enough or at risk enough that they have to have federal protections. And pretty much the rest of the ones on this list, I hope that before I finally retire, that we'll actually have more conservation agreements in place. And we'll have the synergy of all of our folks that are working around the state on these guys. So the last 7 years have been real busy for me because I've been able to switch my hats from being a native fish program manager to now full-time Snail Guy. So that means I really love my job. I get a chance to go explore all of Arizona. And there's a lot of neat places to see in the state. And I get to look for a whole taxon group, our mollusk, that have not really been studied much. So I like to brag that as a biologist, I'm at that spot where a lot of our Bing game biologists were 150 years ago, where they were just learning about these things, where they're at on the landscapes, their life history, their habitat associations, their threats, their population status. So I'm kind of in that area where it's like, great, I get to really learn about these guys, and it's really a lot of fun. So these spring snails, as well as a few land snails, we are now going to be doing a lot more work, and I want to get the land management agencies or landowners, as well as our NGOs, our non-government organizations, more actively involved, and so that we can continue to protect and manage these. So let's talk about our smallest neighbors, spring snails. They're tiny. 2 to 8 millimeters size, so you know what a size of a sesame seed is? These guys are even smaller. They're hard to see. Most of our native snails are very cryptic, which means they're very hard to find and very hard to locate. A lot of them have gone beneath people's notice, so it's pretty exciting now where we're just learning so much more. They have separate sexes, which most snails, especially the land snails, are hermaphroditic. That means they have both male and female reproductive tracts, and when they mate, they go upon their own ways and they're able to produce young. But our spring snails have separate sexes. The females tend to be a little bit larger. They're the ones that have to lay the eggs. So that kind of helps for them. They're short-lived. They're only about a year or so. That means they got to be a fairly fast regeneration time, as far as numbers of, the populations being sustained. That actually is somewhat to a benefit for them because they can adapt a lot faster due to warming temperatures or changes in the environment or something like that. So I think that these spring snails can be resilient as long as they have permanent water sources that are unpolluted. So in Arizona, we have 13 known populations of Pergolopsis, which is one of the genera, and then 3 of the Trionia. So Arizona really still is a frontier when it comes to spring snails. Our neighboring states, California, Nevada, Utah, they have done a lot more extensive surveys of their springs and found all these populations of Pergolopsis in those neighboring states. One of these days, I would like to have Arizona fully looked at, and I imagine we're going to see a lot more populations popping up across our landscapes. But we're at that point where we're just now getting out there. Some of my colleagues, like Cisco, has already found like 3 different new populations up in the Bradshaw Mountains, so, which is pretty exciting. Now, how do you tell the difference between spring snails and some of the more common aquatic snails that are out there? Now, the ones we have over here on the right are our planorbid or ram's horn snails. They look like tiny little bighorn horns. They can actually get fairly large in their size, as you can see compared to this dime. Now, our spring snails are so tiny. They're about the size of FDR's ear on that US dime. So, that's, if you see bigger snails, it's probably not a spring snail. And the spring snails will whirl to the right. So if you have it flat on your hand like it's trying to get away from you, that last whirl curls to the right. Unlike our pond snails or the physids, where if you have it on your hand like it's trying to get away from you, that's whirls go to the left. So the pond snails and the ram's horn snails are very habitat generalist. Those are the ones you're most likely to find in a lot of the waters, whether they're rivers, creeks, ponds, wetland habitats, even including some springs. The ram's horn snails, we find a lot of them in stock tanks. Occasionally I have colleagues of mine or other folks that say, hey, this whole area is just littered with these snails. What are they? And they'll bring me a sample. It's like, yep, those are ram's horn snails. They're a really good food source for a lot of our ducks and other waterfowl. Our pond snails also provide a good food source for a lot of our fish, our amphibians, as well as some of our more aquatic birds, the waterfowl as well. But spring snails are very, very localized in just those spring habitats. So they're not very common. So what does spring snail habitat look like? It can vary quite a bit. So the image on the left is up in the White Mountains. That's a place called Boneyard Bog. And so we get these artesian springs that come up that are natural springs that just kind of bubble up to the surface and then flow down a spring run or spring brook. And so we'll find the spring snails very abundant right at the spring head and a few meters down from that. And that's pretty much typical for most of our spring snails. This other image here is one of our modified springs that's at Page Springs Hatchery. And for the first few years, it wasn't really productive, but now it's gone gangbusters. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of spring snails that are doing really well in that habitat, even though that habitat had been modified over time. So the snails are able to adapt. They like hard substrates, rocky habitat, so cobbles, pebbles, gravel, sand. They like those hard substrates because that's where they are able to attach to rest, as well as to hide from possible predators, some aquatic bugs or maybe leeches. But they also lay eggs on to the hard substrate. And a lot of the hard substrate is providing that surface for periphyton or that biofilm of algae, fungus that kind of grows on there. That's what they graze on. So they use those rocks as like a buffet. They just kind of graze along, just using their radula, their little kind of rasping tongue that just kind of chews away at the surface of those rocks, trying to get at that layer of algae. So they also can be found a lot on leaf litter sticks as well as watercress. For some reason, they love watercress. Generally slower flowing water, not very fast, but they can tolerate low flow as well. Another one of my favorite snails is the amber snails. This is the one I'm most familiar with over the longest time in my career. I got hired as the department's first invertebrate biologist back in 1996. I'd already been working for the agency earlier than that, but they needed somebody who could go down to the Grand Canyon on lots of rafting trips, lots of hiking trips, and work on the Kanab amber snail, our first endangered snail. And so I was like, I'm your dude. So yep, let me go do it. And let me tell you, it was a lot of fun. The more you study these things, the more you really get to love them. They're fascinating creatures. So we have 3 genera of amber snails: Oxyloma, Catanella, and Succinia. Now these are land snails, but we find them in close proximity to the water. So they live on the vegetation that is right along, the spring habitats or shoreline habitats, rivers or streams, as well as wetlands. So these guys are hermaphroditic, so that means, they have both male and female reproductive tracts. And so when they mate, they exchange gametes and go upon their own way. So a colleague of mine actually did some research for his master's thesis at NAU and raised some in captivity, completely isolated. Found out they're capable of being able to self-fertilize. If they can't find a mate, they can, take care of their own business themselves and pop out young. So pretty neat. That makes them really good colonizers. So if they end up getting flushed downstream due to high floods, they might be able to eddy out into a spot that's suitable for them and then be able to create a new colony of snails. So they like to feed on the fungus and bacteria. Again, they're recyclers. They're converting dead and dying plant material into plant food. So I like to consider Vasey's Paradise as my second office. I spent a lot of time down there over the years. Beautiful place to live. But this is one of those reoccurring springs where you can find amber snails at. So John Wesley Powell actually named this spot on his first river trip down through the Grand Canyon. So, and you can see in the background where they blend into the habitat. They usually stay real close to the substrate there when it's kind of damp. But up in southern Utah is a place called Three Lakes, and that's where another population of them occurs in very wetland habitats. So. All right. One of my favorite snails for the state, talussnails. Now these guys are neat because, one, they're large, so I don't have to use my cheaters to see them too often. But they are known for the Sonoran Desert, which is kind of how it's gotten its scientific name, Sonorella. It's kind of based off of the Sonoran Desert. So these are large land snails. They don't have to be associated with water. You can actually find them in a lot of our mountain preserves, the desert landscape, habitats down around the Phoenix area, so in the low desert areas, all the way up into the high, Sky Islands, southeastern Arizona, through the Mogollon Rim and out toward even on the far part of western Grand Canyon, and some other rocky habitats and such. So these guys are about dime to nickel size, so they're fairly big. And often, if you're out hiking along trails or off trail in some areas that's rocky habitat, you might find their shells, which are usually bleached out. So they look like kind of like chalky little white buttons, But they tend to have this brown stripe on them. That's one of their characteristics. That's how you can tell it's a talus snail. It has a single brown stripe, shoulder band stripe, they call it, on its shell. And so based on their pigmentation, they vary. Some of them are very light colored, some of them are dark colored. So. Again, they feed on a lot of stuff, including lichen, some of the moss that occurs in some of those areas that only seasonally kind of fruit up or become edible. But these guys are smart. They spend a lot of their lives sleeping. Think of them like desert tortoises. They are long-lived, 4 to 6 years, maybe as much as a decade. Some of them in captivity, folks have kept them alive for as long as 10 years. So, but most of the time, they're just hunkered down deep kind of underground in the interstitial spaces, what we call hibernacula, where it's cooler, more moist habitat. I think if you're like 3 feet below the surface, it's actually like 40 degrees cooler than the surface. So that's pretty good, especially in places like Phoenix. It gets really hot in the summertime on volcanic basalt rock. So these guys are long-lived. They spend a lot of time sleeping, what we call estivation. And then once they get those environmental clues that they've had a good soaking rain, they can smell the moisture, they can smell that desert smell, or that smell that's like, hey, it's just rained. They wake up and they're like, all right, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to go hydrate, I'm going to go eat, find a mate, and then I'm going to get back under cover before it gets dry again. So These guys get their common name, talussnails, because that's usually where they're associated with, a lot of what they call talus slides. Also rocky hillsides, any place that has a lot of boulders, boulder piles, bases of cliffs where they have deep cracks, places where they can get in and hide and seek that shelter. So, there are about 80 species of talussnails in Arizona. So it's one of our most speciated native snails, a group of snails that we have. And so a colleague of mine, Nick Dana Waters, actually put together this kind of mini poster. And he's identified a bunch of possible new species because he's really got good about finding snails out there in the landscape. And so you can tell that the body pigmentation changes quite a bit amongst some of those. So again, some of these are low elevation, desert. Some of them are higher elevation in the forested or the mountains. Now, there's two other big land snails that are really pretty neat. We have Oreohelix, which is our mountain snail. We also have in the Chiricahua Mountains another genus called Radiocentrum, although honestly they look very similar externally. Now the Oreohelix, or mountain snails, they can be fairly big. They're anything from dime size all the way up to quarter size almost. And we find a lot of them on the Mogollon Rim area, all the way out to eastern Arizona and a lot of the Sky Islands, southeastern part of the state. We do find them up in the mountain, in the canyons, up on the Colorado Plateau, Kaibab Plateau, up and through Grand Canyon. Our mountain snails often will have a double brown stripe on their outer whorl. So that's one of the things that you can kind of clue in. If you're not sure of it, even if you find a shell that's pretty bleached out, you might still see a double stripe, and you're like, ah. But you can also flip them upside down, and their embryonic whorl, they have a larger gap than the talus snails do. That's that little spot there, where you get that cavity there. Now, when they're younger, this one shell you can kind of see if I can get this going. You can see this is like almost a sharper edge on this guy. This one's a younger mountain snail. It's what I call a keel. So that outer whorl has kind of more of a sharper edge to it. So that's one of the diagnostics I look, especially for the smaller shells. And the really young ones actually almost have like they look like little saw blades where they have these fringes that are right around that edge. And I think that's a protective mechanism for, keep from getting eaten by birds. Because if you're a bird, you get something kind of spiky like that, it's going to be kind of hard to go down, when you get eaten. So, our woodland snails, or the genus Ashmonella, really just starting to learn about those guys. And they're pretty little snails. So they're button-sized. They tend to be very dark-bodied. And we find them, again, at those Sky Islands in southeastern Arizona, as well as there's some areas along the Mogollon Rim, which I haven't been to yet, that we have those. But those have a whole series of small, tight whorls. And when they move, it's really interesting to watch as they move their shell around. So they're different than the talus snails and mountain snails.
Does their body go through all those whorls?
No, it doesn't. It's more in the kind of the outer part. So.
In the middle is just.
They use it as a cavity for storing moisture, as well as metabolism, stuff like that. Yep. So a lot of the snail shell, especially toward the middle part, it's not actually used by the snail body, but they still use it for retaining moisture stuff. Sorry. I need to move a little bit faster on my talk, I guess, because it keeps shutting down. So how to distinguish our native land snails from our introduced species. Some of you have already sent me some photos or showed me photos. You have garden snails that are here in the Prescott area, as well as along the Verde Valley, Camp Verde, all the way down the Verde River. We have these in Phoenix as well, surprisingly, even as dry as it is. Now, the garden snails tend to be fairly robust, but they have shells that are very patterned like that and big. They're a good food source for a lot of our birds out there, as well as some rodents. So, while they are introduced, they came in through nursery plants, landscaping plants, and so they are, they're providing that type of benefit for the environment. They're providing food source as well as they're still recycling. Now, I am concerned about these species because they get out into the wild spots where we have native snails, and we're not certain what type of competition there might be. Probably not predation, but there will be competition for the same food sources and shelter and all that. And these guys might have parasites or pathogens that our native species might be at risk of getting. So that's something that we do concerned about. The one over here on the far left is called a decollete snail. And some of you guys have probably seen those already, in your backyards or out on the streets or something like that after it rains. So these guys are predatory snails. So they'll actually follow the slime trails of slugs and other snails, chase them down, and then feed on them. So it's kind of neat, isn't it? So I still have these in my front yard, even though I xeriscaped my front yard probably about 15 years ago. And they're still hanging out there after it rains. It's like, I got them still. So, so these are your introduced species, the ones that don't belong in the state, but we got them.
The brown garden snail, what size is it?
Oh, yeah, they can get fairly big. They can get to be about quarter size. Yeah, some of them get fairly large.
They're eating green vegetation.
Yes, they're primarily vegetarian. Yep. The other ones over there, those are more, omnivores. They'll feed on vegetation as well as other snails and slugs. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Wow, that's pretty good. I don't know what you're feeding them, but apparently they like your garden. Yep, makes for some happy birds around that neighborhood. Okay, land snail habitat, it can vary quite a bit. Generally, what you're looking for is a lot of rocky habitat, places that are going to have a lot of deep spaces, what we call interstitial spaces or hibernacula. So those snails are smart enough to get down deep and then wait out the dry time. So early summer, which is typically fire season in Arizona, these guys are sleeping underground. And so that's something that we've been really looking into, and that's something I'm interested in perhaps following up as a PhD study is. What is the effect of fire on a lot of our native land snails, as well as spring snails? And so we're starting to learn a lot more about how these things are able to adapt to those type of changing conditions and those type of impacts. So up in the higher elevations in the woodlands or the forested areas, they're going to be living a lot of the leaf litter as well. And so right after it rains, is a really great time for them to wake up and say, hey, all right, conditions are great for us to go, rehydrate and stuff. Something about rehydrate too. My colleague who collected some of those Phoenix talussnails, he had pulled them off the rock, so they were estivating, and they created this little calcareous seal. He pulled them off the rock, took them back to his house, weighed them, figured out how many grams they might be, and then he decided to wake them up by getting them wet. So he put them on a wet paper towel, misted them, and then after a few hours, they woke up and they started rehydrating. So he went ahead for the next day or so, just kept giving them food and water, and then he weighed them again. And he found out that those talussnails, the ones that were sleeping and estivating, he figures they had lost about 60% of their body weight from estivating. And so that's amazing, because we can't lose more than 10% of our body weight in water weight and like that, dehydration. But these guys were able to regain 60% more of their body weight by getting rehydrated. So that's a survival mechanism that allows them to be able to endure those type of dry spells. So that was kind of really neat. I'm hoping he's going to publish on something like that. So, what are the threats to our native snails? Development. I'd say our planet is growing a lot with a lot of people and a lot of our footprint. Whether we're paving it over or building housing tracts or industry or something like that. That's one of the things we have to worry about, especially as we move up into the mountains or move into those wet areas, where a lot of our wildlife live. So, and unfortunately, some of those things are, for the most part, fairly permanent. But that doesn't mean that the snails can't adapt sometimes. We still have snails in our neighborhoods. That's something that we're finding out. In fact, the same colleague who did that study found out that some of the flood control dams that they have, the big rip-rack rocks that are between mountain ranges, he's found a talussnail population on one of those mountains and not on the other. But he's found the snails are actually moving across that man-made flood diversion dam. And he's figured it's like, well, that was put in there back in the 1970s. Now it's the 2000s. It's made this much distance over that many decades. And so in probably another 100 years, it's going to make it so all the way over to this mountain range and might start inhabiting that mountain range. Got to think, snails work on a generational time frame for moving across our landscapes. So individual snails don't travel very far unless they get flooded downstream or get picked up by birds or drop somewhere or move somewhere, or even rodents sometimes. But generationally, if there's enough continuous habitat, the snails will be able to produce young, and those young will eventually keep moving. So, other threats include, especially for our springsnails, loss of groundwater in spring habitats. It's getting hotter and drier. There's a lot of straws on the ground pulling water out. Some of our springs are going dry, and so that's a real problem. And then modified springs. Historically, a lot of springs have been modified as spring boxes or piped. So we either have lost habitat altogether, or, like in the case of Page Springs Hatchery, most of those springs have been modified, yet we still have we have 10 populations of spring snails living in among those modified habitats. And some of those populations are very robust and doing quite well. So they're adaptable. One thing that is difficult for them to adapt to is introduced species, especially aquatic nuisance species, aquatic invasive species, ones that are predatory or highly competitive. Crayfish, they eat everything. And once they get into a system, like up in the White Mountains for Three Forks spring snail, they can take over a system. And we started doing our surveys there in the 2000s. By 2003, 2004, we started losing populations of the spring snail up there. And just this year, 18 years later, we finally were able to reintroduce spring snails back there in a protected spring box, one that we excluded from crayfish. So it's taken us that long to finally get to the point where we can get the crayfish out of some of these habitats. That's something I'll talk about later in this talk. But other ones that are going to be problematic are apple snails, the pink egg masses. They look like bubble gum along the Salt River and a lot of our urban lakes in the Phoenix area, Verde River, and I guess we just now have a population or two down in Tucson. But those are ones that we're concerned about. Lower Colorado River as well. Those are eggs. Yeah, highly prolific. Those are South American river snails brought in through the pet trade, and now they're out there in the wild because somebody's unwanted aquarium pets. They're like, I don't want to kill it. I'm just going to dump it in the wild. Don't do that. Then it becomes everybody's problem. They're so prolific that a single female apple snail can produce 15,000 young a year. And problem is there's not a lot of things that are out there eating these things. They're just not our wildlife don't find them palatable. So we always say, don't release your unwanted pets. Do the right thing. Be a responsible owner. If you have to put it in a Ziploc bag, put it in the freezer, and then throw it in the trash. Yeah. Chinese mystery snails. Those are another aquarium pet that's out there. New Zealand mud snails we got from neighboring states. The whole clean, drain, and dry your boats, clean your gear after you've gone to those infected waters. That's how these things got it. We have them in Oak Creek now, and now they're becoming a problem. We're starting to see live populations out there. First, we were doing environmental DNA sampling, getting positive hits. Now we've gone back out. We've really searched pretty well, and we're starting to see them now. So these guys are tiny. Some of the dry specimens we have there are from our hatchery at Page Springs. Yeah, they're actually doing ionic copper treatments to get rid of them. Been successful, but the problem is they just keep getting in there. Sedimentation and overgrazing from livestock. Now this is where we can be more responsive, working with the landowners, our land management agencies, as well as the permittees, to appropriately manage, what type of livestock and how much use and impact. Snails fairly tolerate. They can tolerate a fair amount of impact, but if it's constant and if it doesn't get a break, too much silt is a really bad thing, especially for spring snails. So this is where we can work with, the permittee and the land management agencies, and we can either fence off the spring heads and still be able to provide water and forage, for wildlife and for livestock. So it's something that I would like to work on as far as some guidelines with some of my colleagues later this year, is to provide a smarter way to do water development projects. Wildfires cause erosion as well as poor water quality. When you get that post-fire flooding, which usually happens with a monsoon season, because usually May, June, early July, big fire season for Arizona. When the rains come for the summer, that's when we start getting a lot of erosion, a lot of the ash and debris, a lot of silt from those landscapes that no longer have the ground cover, the grasses and shrubby vegetation holding it in place. That type of ash stuff in that debris will actually change the pH and the dissolved oxygen for some of our spring snail populations. And as far as talussnails, it may actually fill in some of those interstitial spaces, those rocky habitats. But this is something that I'm really interested in studying more. Yeah, and so far a lot of the research out there is the full spectrum, from no effect to complete extirpation or extinction. Yes?
Come from if they're invasive.
Crayfish are not native to Arizona. They were brought in the 1940s and 50s into Arizona as a bait for smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, and catfish. But they were also brought in for erosion or vegetation control for a lot of our canals and irrigation ditches. And unfortunately, crayfish don't stay where we put them. They move into our spots that we don't want them. Yeah, and there's been a lot of bait bucket introductions as well. So, one thing that we are trying to address right now is we need more research, more information on our native snails. So much out there on like the ICUN red list shows data deficient. Same thing with NatureServe. It's like we just don't have enough information. We have a lot of educated guesses, but that's it. And so, but we are trying to address that. In the last 7 years, we have really done a great job getting a lot of new records and information. So, and we're working with a lot of our organizational partners, Phoenix Zoo and Desert Museum. There's a bunch of folks that are very interested in academia as well, to helping us with those abilities to learn more. So the past 7 years, we've discovered 20 new spring snail population. When I say we, I'm giving credit where credit's due. I'm talking about our partner agencies, our partner organizations, academia. It takes a community to do wildlife conservation. It is not a single person or single entity out there. It takes a collective group of partners to push that needle forward on conservation. So that's amazing that we've got 20 new spring snail populations in the last 7 years. So that's great. So we're trying to fill in those blank spots on the map. If it was an ocean, there'd be monsters there. Well, we're Arizona. There'd be snails out there. So it's exciting. We're discovering new populations. We also have added and updated a whole bunch of new records for our land snails. 31 species. So that's great. A lot of those we don't know. And most of these are species of greatest conservation need in Arizona. They're ones that we would like to keep common as much as we can. So it's fun. When we go out looking for snails, it's like a treasure hunt. We're talking about a very cryptic species. You kind of have a vague idea where they might be based on historical records. Remember, a lot of our records were species that were identified early 1900s, before Arizona was a state. We were still, a territory. They didn't have topo maps. The USGS hadn't gotten here yet to, map everything out. So some of their descriptions of sites were based off old mining camps or a mountain peak or something like that. So for me, it's awesome. You get to kind of, it's like, I think it's in this area. Let's go look. Go out there hiking, and it's fun and you happen to find a spot. And you're just like, awesome. I might be the first person to have seen these things in like 50 to 100 years. So, okay. What are the conservation needs for native snails? Well, protect and maintain their habitats. Sounds pretty simple. It's not always that way. But where we can reduce and control threats, that's what we want to do. In the case of crayfish, we've thought of ways that we might be able to kind of exclude them out of spring snail habitat. And then, of course, protecting under land management plans, conservation agreements. That's a big part of my job, is working on drafting those documents. It's all voluntary. It's trying to work together so we can keep these species on the landscape and keep their habitats healthy. So, and then this is where a lot of our partner organizations and academia come in handy. Is the research and helping with finding new populations. So we've learned more about life history about our spring snails due to the efforts from the Phoenix Zoo and now the Desert Museum. So, conservation agreements, I know this is kind of boring, but it's a central document that goes for sometimes up to 25 years, which is great, because these guys are long-lived often, on landscapes, and we want to be able to keep, good management happening. But we have regular work group meetings, a 5-year action plan for figuring out, workload and other funding needs. A monitoring protocol, which is adaptively managed. So as we learn new things, we change that. And then annual progress reports. So we have good documentation. And that helps with our species status assessment. Now, what's really exciting is the last 7 years, we've been really active trying to do actual management for these things, changing some of the habitats. So what we used to have is some old civilian conservation corps, 1930s spring boxes, like up in the Three Forks area, up in the White Mountains. We've been able to modify that by kind of filling it in with these percolation pipes and then rocks and then covering them with pea gravel. And then we put in these black plastic barriers to keep the crayfish out, so the crayfish don't come up there at night and feed on the snails like a buffet. But now that, the snails can get reintroduced, and we just did this back in August. So we just finally got spring snails back to this site after 18 years. And so now that looks like an artesian spring. I bet it is a little bit modified than what a natural state would be, but it will function as a natural spring without having crayfish living there. But this spring box, before we did this modification, I took a photograph, and you could actually count 60 crayfish within this 1 meter square spring box. And it's like, this spring box used to have spring snails, church-cod leopard frogs living in there. After, in the early 2000s, those things weren't there. They were just crayfish. They were feeding on each other. So this is exciting. We're being able to do some improvements on some of these existing historic spring boxes to make the habitat better for the snails. Yes?
How is there that many crayfish in just like that one?
Yeah, I was amazed too.
I'm surprised they haven't like killed each other off.
They
yet.
do. They do. They are cannibalistic.
Yeah, I know
they are
they do.
cannibalistic. They won't feed on each other.
Do they like regenerate or something?
Yeah, no, they're very prolific. They produce a lot of young. And they're crayfish, and they will eat their young too. Yeah, I always tell people nature played a very cruel trick on crayfish. Even though they got these formidable claws, they're very fast when they jet back using their powerful tail muscle. They have a tough exoskeleton. They're very adaptable. They can live in a lot of different aquatic habitats and feed on everything. Nature made them very tasty, so a lot of things like to eat crayfish. But unfortunately, they kind of are a scourge of a lot of our natural waters out there. One of the other protections that we're doing are trying to protect those springs from livestock, feral burros, horses, or if that particular grazing pasture isn't supposed to have livestock, and we get some fires that come through there and knock down some fences, and those fences don't get repaired fast enough, we'll get livestock in there, and that'll trample through that habitat and create it more silty. So we've been able to put some bullpen panels and T-posts to kind of protect those springs. And what we're doing at least ones that we want to try to get crayfish out of, we've also put that crayfish barrier along the lower portion. And we use like that hardware cloth metal mesh at the spring outflow. So that way the water can still flow through, but it's tiny enough that the crayfish can't get through. We use like a double layer and stuff. But this has been exciting. We've been able to work with a whole bunch of different partners, including these two guys, which are with the National Wild Turkey Federation. So talk about, snails and crayfish and, turkeys, oh my. They were like, hey, Jeff, we got, money to, do this riparian project. We're supposed to do good things for snails. You have any ideas? Like, heck yeah, I do. So that was a good project to get started on. And we were successful on this. In fact, some of these habitats, we're actually getting Arizona willow growing up in some of those spots that we haven't had there in decades. So it's pretty neat. So, like I said, our Phoenix Zoo Conservation Center partners, as well as the Sonoran Desert Museum down in Tucson, they have captive populations of our spring snails. And so that's pretty new. Not a lot of folks have actually kept these things in captivity. The Phoenix Zoo were pioneers in getting page spring snail established, and they kept a population there for 8 years. Got 2 publications about life history and propagation. And when the 2011 wallow fire hit through eastern Arizona, that gave us an option. So we were able to, right after that fire, we had to go to the fire camp, get our yellow Nomex, fire shirts on, and our, trousers, go out there, salvage as many spring snails out of some of those springs that were going to get flooded, and we took them to the zoo, as well as our regional office, and we were able to keep those spring snails alive for another year. Unfortunately, the habitat didn't recover fast enough, so we weren't able to get them back out there. We still have populations out there, not many, but we do. But the Phoenix Zoo now has a population of Huachuca spring snails, and they've been highly successful. They started off with 200 founders hopefully male and female, equal numbers. And now they have close to 10,000 of them in that captive setting. So very successful. So we're hoping that they'll be able to do the same thing for San Bernardino spring snail very soon. And then the Desert Museum, hopefully with another rare species, Ketobacchitos trionia, which is a spring snail down in Organ pipe cactus notch. So, and then we are now doing translocations. So we're starting to get them out in the wild. So the zoo's producing a lot, and so we're moving Huachuca spring snails out into the wild, into either low population sites that we've modified the habitat, or new sites that meet all the habitat suitability, which is always a guess because I'm a human. I know what I think is good snail habitat, but I'm not a snail, so I can't really tell you what's ideal. So it still has some risk, but it's worth trying. All conservation takes a little bit of risk. So, now some of you guys might ask, how do you survey for these things? How do you monitor these things? Well, first thing we'll do if we get to a new site is do a presence detection search. So we'll search for 20 minutes to an hour or something like that, just looking. And if we happen to find them, if there's a population there, typically they are fairly robust, and we'll start seeing them pretty soon. And then what we'll do is do a timed count, which gives us a relative abundance. So we'll lay out our tape measure. We'll start at the spring head and work our way downstream some distance, and we'll just search for like 10 minutes or so. And then we'll do multiple like transects just to see how abundant they might be and where they end. And so that gives us an idea of how abundant they might be. But we'll also sometimes we'll set out small sample tiles. And we'll come back later when those sample tiles have that periphyton growth, that algal growth. And then we'll find out, we'll just count the numbers of snails on those tiles, and that gives us a density estimate. It's hard to find those tiles sometimes after they get buried or lost. Or surprisingly, animals move them around. They'll pick it up and they'll kind of chew on it for a while and then drop it off and realize it's not edible. It acts like it's like a sample plate, but it acts like some of the natural substrates. And after being underwater for a while, it just develops that film of algae or the diatoms that the snails will feed on. And so we'll go back and we'll just pick up the tile and we'll count all the snails on there. And we know the exact dimensions, so we can figure out how many snails per cubic inches or centimeters, something like that. That gets us to the density. The other one is search-based, and so that gives us a rough idea of what the population abundance is. It's never perfect because we're not finding them all. We see probably just a fraction of the entire population. But while we're out there, we do habitat associations, we do water quality readings, estimate how much composition of the substrate, and then we also do a threat assessment, which is really helpful for future management and recovery plans. So, wow, I'm going along. Sorry, guys. Land snails. Best time to be looking for these guys is right after it rains, especially a good soaking rain. When the humidity is up, there's lots of moisture. I find early in the morning, right before sunrise or something like that, is a good time to go look for them. I used to think I could get away with not having to, get up early and I could sleep in a bit. But that's not necessarily true. These snails, they're smart. They know how to get out when the conditions are ideal. But that's ideal time. So just think, if it starts raining here, you get at least 1 or 2 nights of good rain. The next morning or so, or next afternoon, even just before dusk, good times to go out, go snailing, go look for them. And how you can help us with citizen science, and so this is especially good for students or kids. That iNaturalist is a free app that is out there that a lot of citizen science and biologists will use. Now this is good for both iPhones and Android, smartphones and tablets. And we have a project called Land Snails of Arizona. And so that is one that you can link to and join. And then you can just go ahead and take pictures of snails. It's really easy. You just, so you find shells or live snails, just get your phone out, open up that app, take pictures, take several pictures, top, bottom, side, and then also get one of the habitat. That's really helpful for us to look at the habitat. And just some basic notes like, where were you? Hopefully it's geo-referenced. You have the location open so that way you can share it with others. This is the nice thing about iNaturalist is other folk can help you with the identification. And so I'm one of the curators for this particular project on iNaturalist. So I'll see all those photos and I'll be able to tell you, oh, this is what I think this is, based on this location, based on the images you sent and the habitat. And so And we've gotten a lot of new records. That first photo I had, we only had like 100, we have like over 400 records now. That's all new stuff. And Game and Fish Department will actually harvest those records, especially the ones that are research grade. When you get a bunch of folks that have commented and say, I know what that is. And, so we get malacologists, true snail guys, that really know how, to identify these things based on various morphological features or stuff like that. So this is a very powerful and easy to use app. You can have a record, in 5-10 minutes, depending on how many pictures you take. And then specific to land snails of Arizona, we keep it real simple. We just ask, did you see live snails or shells? And was it wet or dry? And so that's really helpful information for us. And then you share it with the community. In fact, that's a great way to do a life list and all types of wildlife or plants. So iNaturalist doesn't, you can do everything. So it's a really great thing. The bio blitzes that they offer occasionally, especially some of the national parks or some of the land management agencies will do bio blitzes. And that's like a 24-hour, let's go out with a couple biologists or professors or grad students and go look for certain groups of animals or plants. And then you can record all of those apps, or those observations on this app. So it's a really powerful way to get that information. So, all right. I want to end this talk by thanking all of our partners, our land management and natural resource agencies, our partner organizations such as Prescott Natural History Institute, yes, thank you, the Phoenix Zoo, Desert Museum, Audubon, National Wild Turkey Federation. We have a lot of our apple snail surveys we do on the Salt River. We have Odyssey Aquarium and Sea Life Aquarium coming out and helping us. And so Fish and Wildlife Service. We got volunteers, and that's wonderful. Arizona Game and Fish has actually a page on our website, azgfd.gov, that has volunteer opportunities. I haven't populated a lot of stuff yet because I'm just learning about that new setup they got for becoming a registered game and fish volunteer and those opportunities. But there are things that you could do. Like I said, that iNaturalist is a really good way to, while you're out there hiking or enjoying the outdoors, provide us some snail observations. So, thank you very much. You guys have been awesome. Yes.
Jeff, thank you so much. Before we take questions, real quick, I just want to put a plug, because if you are into iNaturalist, he did such a good job of selling it. The Natural History Institute also has their own project in which we're looking at everything, plants and animals in this area. So ask us more. So now I can open up to questions. I'm going to remind you, Jeff, to repeat the question for the folks watching online.
Does it start from the inner part of the spiral and spiral out, or is it fully formed but in miniature and then grow out?
Actually, it's kind of the later, where it starts off as like a miniature version, but it keeps adding more and more whorls as it gets larger. And so one thing I didn't point out is the mountain snails, the Oreohelix, those are unique because they actually will produce live young. So their eggs are held within the body, and they actually will pop out tiny snails that are fully formed. I had collected some live specimens, and I thought I had like 3 of them. And so by the time I got home and checked, then I had a couple small ones in there, so I actually ended up with like 6 specimens. I was like, oh, this is cool. I got baby snails. Or our Talis snails and most of the other ones will actually lay eggs, individual small eggs that are out there. So, good question. Yeah.
Comparing snails and slugs, is there an evolutionary advantage to having a shell?
That is a good question, yes. So, is there an advantage to having a shell like the snails have versus slugs that don't? Slugs actually have a remnant of a shell that's within their body cavity or just on the outside of their cavity, depending on the species or the group. I would like to think that our snails have a competitive advantage because they have their shelter. They can attach to a hard substrate, whether it's leaf litter or rock face, and they can create a calcareous seal or an epiphragm seal that they're allowed to estivate or to sleep. And then they can add additional seals over time, so that way they can control a temperature off that rock, or being able to moderate the amount of CO2 or metabolic waste that they have. Where our slugs really have to be tied to wet environments because they don't have a home to go back and just seal themselves off. So I think the slugs are really limited on their space where they have to be. And if the spring dries up, those slug populations aren't going to be around. There's just not enough moisture for them. Where the snails maybe can get lucky enough and move, over time, or just wait until the next, good rain happens.
So who would win in a fight, a snail or a slug?
Oh, I love my snails.
I'm Team Slug over here, everyone.
Yes. No problem.
Do you have any information on indigenous people throughout the history of this area using snails as a source of protein and food?
That's a really good question. Indigenous folks using snails as food or for other resources? I do not, unfortunately. But there are a number of Native American or indigenous, what do they call them, creation myth, or creation stories. In fact, the Navajo, the Din, they have one about when they came to this current realm. And actually, the hero of that story is actually the tiny snail. So when they moved from the underworld to this current world, it was the snail that had brought fresh water to our current, our world. And so it's a wonderful story. And, of course...
I have eaten some snails, and they're fairly delicious and crunchy.
They have a lot of protein, they have a lot of carbohydrates, so yes, I bet a lot of our, indigenous Native American folks had used snails to supplement their meals. Like I said, if it wasn't for the humble snail, a lot of wildlife would probably go hungry for a faster meal. And the Native Americans and indigenous folks, they knew how to harvest things off the landscape. So, go ahead.
Example of the importance of snails in the Florida Everglades. They have a giant snail called an apple snail, not like this one. It's bigger than a coin. And there's an endangered
Snail kite.
bird, the snail kite, that feeds exclusively on those snails. And they've been endangered because all saucered and drained for farms and things like that. So there are fewer, and the only place that really had them is in the Everglades. The Everglades also has tiny little mounds all over the place, tiny islands where dirt comes off and trees grow on those islands. Each island, almost each island, has its own specific species of snail, and one from another. And they are endangered because people go pick them.
Oh, I see. Go ahead.
Is the neural system of a snail relatively complex, like say cephalopods, and distributed, like cephalopod?
Yeah, the nervous system of snails, how complex? I don't know about that. I do know that snails go through, or most of our snails will go through life with three primary senses. Smell being one of the big ones for them, touch, and taste. So sight, vision is very rudimentary for a lot of our snails. They can see light and dark, so if something suddenly gets in front of them, they usually kind of curl back into their shell because they're just like, oh, that's a predator. And I don't know how much they use the light as a clue, visual clue for activity, especially for spring snails, possibly. Some of our Phoenix Zoo colleagues have noticed that as soon as the lights come on for daylight mode in their captive refugia, they see a lot more of the spring snails out. And then over the next few hours, the numbers kind of seem to disappear, hiding more in the deep spots of that refugia habitat. So that might be something, but we know that a lot of our snails, especially the land snails, will use smell, taste, and touch. And actually, snails' ability to smell is greater than dogs. They make dogs look like humans. Their ability to smell molecules of food or possible mate or moisture are really incredible. So, okay.
You always see a trail from a snail, or
yes.
at least I've always seen a trail of a snail. What is that stuff? Is that something that they use so that they can look?
That's their story. Yes. They use it as it's a lubricant, allows them to travel over a lot of surfaces, whether it's rough surfaces or smooth, or so what you see is a slime trail that's left behind. And a lot of folks probably don't realize, but snails actually produce several different types of slime. They have some for locomotion, for moving. They have some for adhesion, which is you find them underneath leaves or on the walls or sometimes on ceilings. They have one for, they can use for estivating, for creating that calcareous seal, the epiphrem seal. They have one that they can change the proteins around for both defense. So if you, like especially the slugs, you poke a slug, it's going to change the proteins in its slime to become super sticky. And our talussnails do that too. I've tried to take some tissue samples off the tails of these talussnails. And immediately they start creating this really super sticky, slime. And at the point where it's like you can't get their tail tip off the razor blade, you have to actually scrape it off because it's that sticky. And it's like that fast. And so now I have to actually kind of relax them by putting them in water for, hours at a time to get them all bloated, to be able to do that properly.
You give them a little spa treatment and
But they also have, I imagine, some slimes that they could use for healing. So if a snail gets partially crushed, they may be able to re-glue their shell back. I've been working on the Kanab amber snail project long enough that I've seen a whole bunch of their shells, that have looked like they've been fractured, possibly stepped on. Yet the snail was able, even in that short time frame that they were alive, to glue it back into shape and still be alive. So from an endangered species, Section 7, Section 10 is saying, well, if you stepped on that snail and you didn't kill it, is it take? Or is it still alive? Yeah. So, okay. Let's see. Go ahead. You had your hand up, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so on a lot of the Talis pictures, they were on moss. Is that one of their food sources?
Is moss one of the food sources for talussnails? Yes, we believe that at least some of that is. They have observed some that are feeding on certain types of lichen. I know that's one of your favorites, is lichens. Yep. But also a lot of leaf litter stuff that has kind of that fungus, or bacteria growing on them. We know that at least a lot of our spring snails like to feed on diatoms as well. Yeah. And I know that our amber snails really like pollen. For some reason, they love watercress pollen. Yeah. So.
Could snails be a pollinator? I'm sorry, I jumped in. Are they pollinating?
I couldn't say. I have done some behavioral observations on them, but my attention span isn't quite so long. Go ahead.
What are snails' breathing mechanism?
What are snails' breathing mechanisms? Breathing mechanism. Our spring snails actually have gills, and so they're actually able to pull oxygen, through the water, using their gills. But our land snails might. I know they have rudimentary lungs that they're actually able to bring in, but I think even off their skin surfaces, they might have kind of micropores that they're able to actually get oxygenate through the surface of their skin, which is why that it's so important for them to have, moisture on their body. So that's why, a lot of our snails really are clued in on those moist conditions, especially our land snails that like, right after it rains. But that's a good question. I don't know the answer definitively on, which ones have just lungs versus which ones might have gills.
So let's do like one or two more questions, and then Jeff will be around up here along with all of these snails to meet if you have more after that. But these are great questions.
Okay. See who had anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
I'm just guessing because of all the interest in climate change all over the planet, there are probably snail scientists that are watching snails
I think so.
migrating to wetter or cooler climates.
Yes, that is a really good snails and as a metric for what's happening with climate change. And I know that at least one paper that I've cited in a couple of our conservation agreements did a study back east about how they used to find the snails at this elevation, but then of course as things are getting warmer and drier, they're now moving up onto higher elevation where those areas are retaining that the temperature or that moisture. And that's something that would be really worth looking into for our snails here in Arizona, because we're already very dry and very hot, and we're seeing a lot less precipitation from snowpack or winter and summer rains. So I think these are a really good indicator of what might happen, as far as some of our wildlife populations.
City of Prescott now is encouraging detention and retention ponds as there's more and more infill with more and more parking lots. For example, on Whipple Street in the 5-block area, there's at least 4 detention ponds. 2 of them are spring-fed, but some of them are seasonal. They would be an interesting place to study to see what ends up inhabiting these. In a particularly wet summer, the one directly behind my property is wet all the time all summer long.
Yes.
It will dry out, and dry season.
Do any of those have any type of like aquatic vegetation or shoreline vegetation? Do those retention ponds?
These retention ponds, two of them have natural vegetation came in, things like cattails and stuff came in. But mostly they're putting up, you know, the ponds because of rocks and they're ugly, ugly blanked ponds right now.
Yeah. But that would be a really good study, you know, to see, you know, what comes in there. I suspect that you're probably going to get your pond snails, the physids. They're really good about exploiting habitats, especially after disturbance events. And that's something that would be ideal for students or, you know, community folks to kind of look into. And even from those wet dry cycles. We see this happen in a lumber situation, especially captive populations. We see it at our hatcheries, or we see it, you know, like the Audubon Center down in Phoenix, you know, when they got their fish tank. It's like, oh, we got all these pond snails. It's like, what happened? It's like somehow they came in through aquatic plants, or they came in through waters, and then once they get there, suddenly they realize, like, oh, this is, you know, new ground, and so their numbers will start expanding to a boom and bust, and then they'll, you know, they'll get to a point, and then they'll drop down to a carrying capacity, and then once it goes dry, it'll be interesting to see how long it takes for them to repopulate that. So I suspect that those retention bases might get some snail populations over time. So.
These are wonderful questions. Of all the things that I never knew to ask about snails, I just learned so much. Thank you, everyone. So join me in thanking Jeff Sorensen one more time, the Snail Guy. And as a special token of our appreciation at NHI, we like to give our speakers a hat so they can rep us. There you go. Thank you so much, Jeff. And so any of you, if you have extra questions for Jeff, you're welcome to come up. Come see the snails. They're so cute if you didn't get a chance. And thank you all for coming.